Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today about boards. We're going to get started in just a few minutes as we wait for some folks to pop in here. So just hang tight and we'll be with you shortly. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Ibrahim, and I'm Program Manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio at the Mass Cultural Council. The Cultural Investment Portfolio's focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and we are excited to deliver today's workshop to you on the role of an effective board during times of stress. We've all been through times of stress. This workshop is part of the Mass Cultural Council's Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. Over the next 5 months, we will be offering 2 free workshops per week in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, and board governance. We wanted to start this series with board governance because success to recover from COVID requires a strong partnership between staff and board. And the board governance is often overlooked in this process. Joining us today are Claire West and Molly Quinlan Hayes from Claire West Consulting. They're going to introduce themselves in just a minute, but I wanted to go over a few ground rules for today's session. Number one, if you wouldn't mind renaming yourselves, we want to see your name, of course, but if you wanted to add the organization that you represent, that would be wonderful, just so we can see who's in the room and the demographic differences here. We will, of course, have time for questions, so please use the Q&A feature, not the chat, but the Q&A feature. It helps us keep all the questions organized. So we'll have plenty of opportunities for that. This session is being recorded and it will be available on our website and our YouTube channel afterwards. You will be getting an email from me when those resources are available. My colleague, Kaylin King, is here. Many of you may know Kaylin. She will be, there's, hi, Kaylin. She'll be providing some resources in our chat box as we go along and some comments. So we want to keep that together. Additional materials that Claire and Molly want to share, including today's presentation and some homework documents, will be emailed to you afterwards. I do want to just to put out there that this is actually a 2-part series. So you're at part 1. That's a great place to start. And next week on February 9th at 10 a.m. is part 2 of this session. So if you haven't registered for part 2, please do so. Kaylin's going to put the link up on the chat so you can register for part 2 if you haven't seen that already. At that session, we're actually going to have a few leaders from our field to really give perspective to this, because one of our priorities is that we wanted to also have best practices, but then also hear from everybody who's gone through this. So at that session, we're going to have leaders from Zoo New England, Provincetown Art Association and Museum, and Tower Hill Botanic Garden sharing their experience of board governance during COVID. This session will run 90 minutes, including time for Q&A. And with that being said, I'll hand it over to Claire and Molly.
Thank you for being here. Thank you to Mass Cultural Council for demonstrating leadership in responding to constituent express needs in a time like no other. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kaylin. My name's Claire West, Principal, Claire West Consulting. And my partner, Molly Quinlan Hayes, and I are presenting the session today through Claire West Consulting. I am a rapidly graying, short, white woman wearing a black dress and intermittently today glasses. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Tohono people. And over to Molly.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Molly Quinlan Hayes. I am a middle-aged white woman with freckles and glasses. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek people. We're here to talk about I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say, Molly, before, sorry to interrupt you, I just wanted to mention that we did look at all of the registrants that were signed up as of yesterday, and we really paid attention to your concerns and your answers to our registration questions. So please know that we have attended to that, and we believe that for the most part, your concerns will be addressed today, and for those that aren't, it will make for some interesting Q&A toward the end of the session. Thank you, Molly. Sorry.
No, thank you, Claire. We're talking about governance in times of stress today, so we thought we'd begin with just talking about governance. One definition that nonprofit governance has a dual focus, achieving the organization's social mission, as well as ensuring that the organization is viable. This fiduciary responsibility held by the board of directors or board of trustees is the exercise of authority over the explicit actions the organization takes. Good nonprofit governance is all about focusing on the processes for making and implementing decisions that will continue to advance an organization's principles and mission, providing strategic leadership to a nonprofit organization. So what could be different about governance in times of stress? Well, today we will propose a number of board governance dynamics and issues that come into greater focus in the current and other types of crises, and share ideas and tools to address them in ways that are healthy and productive for board members, both individually and collectively. We want to talk to you about not only the challenges presented by the current social and economic environment, but the opportunities that this unique time presents to us.
Molly, are we running a poll here?
Yes. The first thing we'd like to just get a bit of a handle on who's on the call with us today. So if you could just quickly let us know your role in your organization, that would be great. And Caitlin, will we see the results of those?
I'll just say it right here. So as of right now, we've got 13 folks. That's 37% of our attendees who are board members. We have 14 or 40% who are chief executives, and 8 people or 23% who are other.
Wow, yay, good representation from the board. And just looking at the participants list, we have wonderful participants here, some of my favorite organizations. All right, Molly, did you want to say anything further about the poll results, or should we just move on?
No, thank you. We've tried to prepare today's remarks to have a conversation with both the board perspective and the staff perspective. So we hope that you will get that from today.
Well, what we're going to cover today, we're going to tell you what we're covering in part 1 and part 2. So this is part 1, as Michael mentioned, of 2 webinars concentrating on effective boards during times of stress. And it's up on the screen, but we hope you'll register for part 2 on February 9th, although both of them are self-contained and can be taken independently. Today's agenda will cover the criticality of mission and focus, the board's role in supporting the chief executive, methods for transparent communication internally, the information needs of today's board members, the meaning of the current numbers, stepping up board participation, enhanced external communication, stress creating opportunities, and emergency succession basics. And then we'll wrap up both together. We encourage Q&A posting in the Q&A throughout the presentation. If your input can wait until the last section of today, great. If you want to contribute to a particular section, go ahead and post, and Kaylin will direct us to your comment.
Next, we will, at the end of today, offer you 3 homework opportunities. If you'd like to take advantage of those between now and next week. And then next week, we will be covering these items: supporting the CEO in making difficult decisions, determining mission critical programming, approaches to scenario planning. We'll be digging deeper into the financials, using tension as a productive tool, and embracing the devil's advocate. How to handle the unexpected. As Michael mentioned, we'll have 3 guest speakers to share stories from the field. And again, we'll have time for discussion and wrap up. We're going to start out with the criticality of mission and focus. I'm sorry, I'm learning some of this PowerPoint as we go. So let's talk about criticality of mission and focus. Your mission is what distinguishes you. It's your reason for being. Commitment to mission must be primary, above individual programs, partners, vendors, even staff, although I know that's not a very popular sentiment.
It's sometimes useful to reflect on what a mission is. We have sophisticated attendees today, and so we're not going to rewrite missions, but an analogy that you can share is your mission is the car you're driving. The vision is what things will look like when you've reached your destination. Your values are how you drive the car. Your purpose is why you're driving in the first place.
Those who have supported you over time are supporting your mission, and communicating that you are focused on that in this difficult time can encourage them to continue that support. As aptly put by our colleagues at SMU Data Arts, what are your core values? Who are you most committed to serving? What's the source of your strength? And keeping mission-centric service to the community first, when the very confines of community are changing, will inevitably shift cultural organizations' programs, communications, and content distribution strategies. Looking forwards towards opportunities to fulfill your mission that may be possible in our new environment is the healthiest path and can be exciting. What's critical in this moment is to ensure that you are looking outward, not inward, regarding how to carry out that mission. Serving your community, building stronger ties, collaborating with other arts and cultural organizations, as well as non-arts and cultural organizations, makes you more relevant and resilient to withstand and thrive in the current recovery. This commitment to service and not self will also resonate with your supporters and stakeholders. As you know, they are giving not just to your organization, but because they care so much about the cause that you are addressing. How to ensure that your decisions are congruent with your mission? Keep your mission statement front of mind at all times, literally and figuratively, on your website, on your board of directors meeting printed agenda. Have room for discussion of your mission, core values, and make sure that your decision-making aligns with that at every board conversation. Existing and new board members should demonstrate active support of the mission, and any donations accepted should be used for mission-critical activity only. As our friends at Theater Communications Group have stated, what you do now, how you treat your patrons and employees, will be what everyone remembers after the COVID-19 crisis recedes.
And your mission is probably intact. For those who find it difficult to plan in this time, bear in mind that carrying out our mission may be more challenging. However, for example, a natural history museum I worked with was embarking on their 3-year strategic plan in February 2020. They determined that no matter what, they are still an education and research institution, and that they could continue to fulfill that mission and proceed with their plan, and they did. Before we move on to the board's role in supporting the chief executive as she, he, they steers the new course, we can pause for some input. I wonder if there are any Q&A, and if not, we'll just move on.
No questions just yet.
Thank you, Michael. In your scale of the role of the board, where does full, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt her for just a moment. I've been told by Kaylin that the PowerPoint is not showing, and that is something that as we go through is going to become more and more important. So I'd like to ask now.
I can see it.
I think we can see it now. We couldn't see it just while you were speaking, Molly.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we're going in and out of PowerPoint and seeing our faces, so hopefully that'll work okay. Thanks, please go on, Claire.
Thank you. Okay, well, the next slide should say the board's role in supporting the chief executive. So I'll just reiterate, in your scale of the role of the board, where does full support of your chief executive sit? That's always a governance benchmark. Now, particularly at this time, they, the CEOs, are charged with some of the most difficult and creative tasks of their professional life. Can you be fully supportive? The board needs to listen, to be there to chair and to offer suggestions building on the chief executive recommendations. Support of the chief executive at this time refers to increased responsibility in the time of COVID held by certain team members. So this slide, its point is really the mid part of the slide, which reads effective leadership, bullet points, CEO, functional leaders within the organization relating to staff primarily, the board chair and the board finance chair. So this is sort of a cross section of the leadership of your organization working together as a team in this most critical time. We assume that you're fully behind your CEO and that you're demonstrating that. Now, what happens if you do not feel a chief executive is making wise decisions and setting mission critical courses? I'd be interested in hearing from other consultants and you all on this issue. However, in another section of this workshop we're conducting, we're addressing board executive relationship transparency. Communication is everything in the shared leadership of chair and CEO. The board chair should set the example for this. Now, in a recent experience, I left a beloved board I was sitting on because I felt I could not continue to meet the board member requirement that I support the executive director. I did not feel that the organization was in imminent danger, but I did feel that the person in the position was the wrong fit. So I left. I did have a long discussion with the chair first, and I gave 6 months notice. Now, in conversation with leadership in organizations based in New England and receiving support from Mass Cultural Council, who will speak with us in session 2, there were inspiring stories of the push-pull between executive leadership and board, and how that inevitably does lead to stronger decision-making and a trusting relationship between staff and board.
A couple of other thoughts about ways in which to strengthen that relationship are always to build trust, to encourage building a culture of inquiry. The board chair and ED, of course, need to be in alignment and have regular and honest communication. A little bit more on that in a minute. That the board reads and understands information shared with them, which we'll also talk about a little later. To be clear about the chair and the executive's interdependence, but also to be clear about where their spheres are separate and where they overlap. And this is a time to really have honest conversations about your organization's tolerance for risk, experimentation, and failure.
So we'll move on and dig a little deeper into methods for transparent communication between board and staff, a little we've mentioned earlier on. We began this session with the criticality of mission. It's imperative that all board members and executive staff be committed to this mission, particularly today. Not only should the mission be kept in view, literally and figuratively at all times, but we might consider a weekly or bi-weekly update to the board from the chief executive or the board chair, focused on mission moments as a reminder about what drives your board members to invest themselves in this mission. A tone of mutual respect should be set and acceptance of constructive debate and inquiry into all aspects and areas appropriate to the board. While respecting needed confidentiality, there's more need than ever for transparency in the spread of information. If some within the organization feel that they're in the dark, it will only add to the stress, professional and personal. How are we keeping people safe? How are we responsibly using limited funds? Are donors' wishes and restrictions being strictly followed? Are we meeting commitments? If not, how are we negotiating them to mutual satisfaction? How are we managing risk? To ensure transparent communication, everyone needs to feel secure in bringing up any issue, good news, bad news, popular or not, and know that their perspective and issue will be heard. Consider all settings for this, such as individual conversations, committee task force meetings, board newsletters, and private board webpage or portal. Is the agenda for board meetings something to which everyone can contribute? Are board meetings run in such a way that everyone is encouraged to participate? Is the CEO's role participatory but not overriding? Are tough questions and dissent accepted and addressed? Are assumptions verbalized and tested against reality? We will talk more about using tension and conflict and embracing the devil's advocate in session 2.
Are there any questions before we segue to our next segment?
None so far.
All right. Thinking about the information needs of today's board members. What kind of information do board members need and should expect to make good decisions at this time? Firstly, make sure that everyone is encouraged to use information and data for decisions, not emotions or personal attachments, stress or fatigue, which I know a lot of us are dealing with on an ongoing and building basis. I think it's important to agree on a reasonable amount and type of information for everyone's sake, since everyone is stretched so thinly these days. What will help you make good decisions, not just what you may be simply curious about, or that you've collected in the past and may not be relevant today? Who's going to gather and prepare the information, and who will interpret it on behalf of the organization? Of course, financials are critical. Making sure that board members have access to the P&L, budget to date with variances, financial statement, and cash flow projections. Looking at participation figures if you currently have active programming going on. And looking at formerly reliable funding sources, which may not be so reliable since the pandemic. What are your backup plans should funding dissipate? A lot of funders who had been traditional funders went away in COVID so that they could fund essential needs. And the board needs to know the organization did not lose them for any other reason. However, we also would like to give a shout out to those funders who were so flexible and very quickly pivoted and allowed organizations to move project-based funding into general operations. You might consider, if you don't have, a set of board dashboards to monitor progress on goals and see where course corrections might be necessary. A dashboard is a simple data visualization of key goals and performance metrics to make it easy for board members and other stakeholders to see where things stand and if progress is being made. Dashboards often are built to demonstrate statistics related to finances or programs, but they can also visualize impact data, activity, and also board performance. Dashboards are designed to provide a snapshot. However, a good dashboard can also show trends over time as well as current information. Here are some examples from Blue Avocado of dashboards. Here you see a grid that is titled Finance. It has 3 columns across the top, a target, 6 months ago, and now. And the metrics down the left side are days of unrestricted cash on hand, net surplus or deficit year-to-date compared with year-to-date budget, government funding year-to-date, which was projected at 52% of budget, and finally, the days from the end of the month to when the board receives financial statements from the CFO. As we look at, for instance, the top line, days of unrestricted cash on hand, this organization's target was 45 days. 6 months ago, it was 65 days. And right now, it's looking better, 18 days. Looking again at the next line, net surplus or deficit year-to-date compared with budget, this organization's target is within $25,000 or better. 6 months ago, however, this organization was at $42,500 below budget. Now it's gotten better to $28,000 below budget to date. Next, I'm going to show a graphic that Blue Avocado recommends thinking about, and this really looks at the same colors that you would see on the dashboard of your car. Red, which is a warning to act, yellow, which is something to be watchful of, and green being something to celebrate because you've succeeded. So here's an example of that same grid using these color markers for easy interpretation. In this finance column, looking at days of unrestricted cash on hand, 6 months ago, we had 65 days of cash on hand, which is green. That's very good. However, now we're in the red zone with only 18 days left of cash on hand. Net surplus or deficit with our goal of $25,000 or better. 6 months ago, we were at 42.5 below budget, which was worrisome. We're improving a bit now at 28,000 below budget to date. So we've coded this yellow as something to be watchful of. Again, it's really important to have agreement on where these markers of act, watch, and celebrate fall so that everyone's interpreting data in the same way. Let's look at a couple of other examples. Here's a grid labeled program and impact. Across the top, again, we have our target metric 6 months ago and our metric now. And down the side are a number of really varied types of program. Hopefully you can interpret some of these for your own types of activities. The number of first-time clients enrolled, the number of GED certificates obtained, e-petition signatures gained, the capacity of paid seats per theater performance, and the number of presentations to local houses of worship, companies, and neighborhood groups. As you look at these targets, past figures and current figures, again, you can use this color coding to identify where you are meeting your goals in green, and those places where you might need to be watchful and a little bit cautious, those that are in yellow. And finally, given the subject of this webinar, let's look at the board of directors. This grid is titled Board of Directors, and the metrics down the left side are attendance at board meetings, which the target was 75%. 6 months ago, that was at 75%. Now it's at 85%. Executive performance or executive director's performance evaluation completed on time, which was to be done by February 15th. Wasn't applicable 6 months ago, but it was done by February 13th. So here in this color-coded version, that is green, success. And finally, new board members. The target was to gain 4 new board members by September 30th. 6 months ago, you had 2 new board members, so that was in the caution phase. Here at August 15th, it's still the same 2. So that's color-coded red as something that is in the caution area. Again, understanding where these interpretations come from and who does the analysis is important. A few other questions to look at in terms of the information needs of today's board members. How are you managing risk? There is an upcoming webinar in this series that's led by the fabulous folks at the Arts and Business Council of Greater Boston, specifically on this. But in the meantime, you want to keep in mind, are you ensuring compliance and obligations with financial standards, with your guest artists, HR regulations, contracts and leases, all of those kinds of things? Are you making sure that your insurance is up to date? Are you ensuring that you're meeting requirements of donors, including their reporting expectations? If you have staff, of course, these issues are the responsibility of staff, but responsible board members will expect reports to assure that they're being handled. It also may be particularly important to make sure board members are receiving and discussing other information sets, such as staff morale. If you come back for part 2 of this webinar, you'll hear some great stories from the Gore Place about how their staff stepped up in taking care of staff members. Oh, and from Zoo in New England. And they really stepped up in making sure that staff members were taken care of during a really heavy holiday programming season. COVID-19, CDC updates, also looking at the many reports that come out on a regular basis regarding projections and guidance for reopening. Looking at federal assistance packages and new emergency grants that you may be eligible for. Considering trends in like organizations. And making sure that you're aware of advocacy alerts, both local, state, and federal. This is particularly key when you look at, for instance, the success of the Save Our Stages grant program in the most recent federal stimulus bill, which was the result of intense advocacy and lobbying in 2020 by both for-profit and nonprofit performing arts spaces. And we invite you and encourage you to attend the advocacy sessions of this series the last week of June. You might also, if you don't already have on your board agenda, a short time period at each meeting to educate and explore a priority. What is in the new federal aid package, what a reserves fund is and how you might create one, and other critical governance issues. Before we move on, are there any questions or thoughts about what today's board members need in terms of information and data?
We don't have any questions yet, but folks are encouraged. I know we just had a few join us a moment ago. Feel free to ask your questions as we go along using the Q&A. We'll organize it that way, but none quite yet.
Great, thanks, Michael.
Okay, the meaning of the current numbers, which is probably a little bit different than the meaning of the current numbers in before times. This subject's covered in depth in other session choices in the months of March and May, led by different consultants. We hope you'll register. However, an overview is relevant to this session. And I'm just going to bounce it over to Molly for a little bit.
When you look at numbers, these are basics, but just to keep in mind that which numbers are helping you in terms of reporting on the past, and which numbers will help you be predictive about the future, and which are most useful at this point in time. Also, to be clear about what are fixed expenses and what are not in terms of revenue, donations, partner commitments, what can you be flexible on, and what can you not be flexible on. Claire?
So I can't remember if we made a slide on this, Molly, but we wanted to talk about a list of the financial documents that the board will have to interpret at meetings. Actually, go back one, Molly. We don't need this slide up right now. Nice. Okay. So these are financial documents that the board has to interpret in these times, not necessarily in the before times, but you'll always want them to be looking at a revised operating budget, current balance sheet, assets and liabilities, cash flow sheet, no matter how you have it formatted, cash margins, quarterly operating budgets, if you're doing it that way, unrestricted net assets, status of any loans, and budgeting with comparisons to projections and to year over year, potentially current interest rates and investment performance, and lease agreements. Yes, Amy, you have a comment that you'd like to show this list, and Molly reminded me before today to make a slide out of this, and I didn't. We'll make sure you get that list, no problem. So, pleasure, Amy. So here is why the treasurer or another member of the finance committee, preferably not the executive director, should present something that looks like the next slide. Okay, so for those of you that need the slide described, don't worry if you can't read the figures in the columns. That's not the point. This is a slide that shows the way that a really fabulous treasurer of a board that I sit on presents his financial reports at the board meetings. And it's what you can see is blue arrows pointing to certain areas of the report. And this is because he wants us, the board members, to all look in certain areas, and then he will interpret those areas for you. Like, for instance, here, he's got his arrows pointing at certain areas, and then he's got the notation to the side that says key takeaways. Bullet points: cash drawdown slowed by offsetting revenues from COVID appeal. Next bullet point, receivables up. Next bullet point, endowment up due to market conditions. Next bullet point, liabilities down. Next bullet point, we are currently liquid and solvent. So my point being that we may all know how to read financial documents, but they still tend to sort of just be a bunch of numbers, and it's good to have what I like to think of as a docent guided tour through the financial report. So if we go to the next slide, again, it doesn't matter what the numbers are or what the line items say. What I want you to see is that there are blue arrows pointing at certain areas, and there are green arrows pointing at certain areas. And I'll just say what they say. The blue arrow, 2021 budget revised in July when decisions made to delay live performances until January, February 2021. By the way, they're still delayed. And then key changes, he notes a drop in earned revenues, an 11% reduction in total operating expenses, an operating loss doubled, but cash on hand could still cover. And then he notes some key takeaways from the green arrows. And I won't go through those bullet points, but I do think that this became a very popular method of presenting financial reports. So thanks, Molly. So what does the board do with this information? The figures inform the board on the financial position and what the chief executive and finance committee are doing with those figures. If the organization is board-led, the board makes those decisions. Otherwise, the board lends advice, just advice, unless emotional policy change is required to move forward, such as borrowing funds, getting a line of credit, tapping the endowment, authorizing the use of reserves, or adjusting investment portfolios. Additionally, the board works alongside the executive and finance committee to activate the tripwires in the scenario contingency plan, which has been built by a leadership team, that sort of cross-section of leadership that we talked about in the beginning. I lost my place. Here we go. And which we cover in session 2 of this workshop. Molly and I are going to talk a lot more about scenario planning, contingency planning, strategic planning. For our purposes of this discussion, each scenario is only as good as the triggering event that puts it into motion. So those decisions will be made by board and staff in the knowledge of the implications of various options for moving forward in the face of uncertainty. Examples of financial decisions that you have been making or will be making include what are the tools for cash flow for the short term? For example, accelerating receipts somehow, deferring payments, liquidating assets, tapping rainy day funds because it's raining, requesting to convert project funding to general operations from your funders. You'll want to examine your income drivers. Ironically, if you've had the good fortune to be a nonprofit with a significant percentage of your revenue from earned, that is now working against you, and you will have been or will be working on your contributor. And I'll just mention here that the tax exempt incentives for giving from 2020 remain in 2021. And national analyses have determined that even though your donors tell you that they donate because they love you, they're happy to benefit from the current tax incentives. What we're going to post here is a little scenario planning cheat sheet slide, which again, we will cover more later on. And if I describe this slide, it says at the top, scenario planning process, : if this, then whatever. So the first arrow is a black arrow pointing to the right. It says establish assumptions. Now, my assumption is that you all have probably been doing scenario planning every week since the beginning of COVID. But I love this as a little cheat sheet. So underneath the black arrow, it says, what are the current knowns and unknowns? What are the non-negotiable principles? What are the top priorities? Number 2, it's a dark blue arrow called gather data. Run some numbers. Where are we in the fiscal year? What's happening with revenue, expenses, cash flow reserves? What do we have to work with? What triggers, number 3 arrow is a slightly lighter blue. Number 3, select courses of action. And under that arrow, it says, what triggers action? If, then. What time frame for decision making? What checkpoints within, I'm going to say that again. What checkpoints within scenarios do we agree on? How will we communicate internally and externally for changes? Final arrow is a pale blue. Number 4, act, monitor, and iterate. Stay agile, monitor the environment, optimize opportunities aligned to the organizational core values, culture, and priorities, anticipate the future as far as you can, track trends, identify ways in which the organization might reinvent itself.
I would like to just comment on one thing that I think is really valuable about this slide. Goes back to our very first comments about how mission is critical. And mission really appears in bullet 1 in terms of non-negotiable principles. And again, at the end, in terms of aligning to organizational core values. And so in those rare instances, but when you have an individual who is kind of looking at something that is really mission creep or really kind of outside of these bounds, this is a great neutral tool to make sure that you're staying within the construct of your mission.
Thank you, Molly. Okay, if there's no input, this slide is available for your use afterwards. We'll move on to stepping up board participation, because now is not the time for board members to be missing in action. Now's the time to be active. No change has ever come from stasis. So here are some actionable tools and ideas to motivate and guide boards individually and boards as a whole. Let me say that again, guide board members individually and boards as a whole at this time. Although we don't want board members to be phoning it in at this time of remote meetings, although they kind of are, we have to acknowledge the uncertainty and disconnection that the board is dealing with remote engagement, and concentrate on the pros of electronic meeting convenience and create more frequent connection in smaller doses. The following are the following are distinct examples of increased board attention that's necessary at this time. The board chair must be a companion for the chief executive, and the communication needs to be a little bit more frequent than in past times. If you have a board that meets quarterly, now's the time to pass a motion at a board meeting to temporarily meet on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. There's no need to change your bylaws to do this. Now's the time for board members to pull out the stops on the talents they particularly brought to the table. Use board members' time and expertise wisely, make their experience as positive and contributory as possible. A board member may appreciate the individual call or email from the executive staff asking for input on a particular issue or problem. Board members must show up to board meetings. So board meeting agendas, what works best for your particular situation? Should the following be part of the meeting agenda provided prior to the meeting or eliminated temporarily? For instance, the consent agenda, committee and staff reports, old business, new business. The point is to be sure to allow for enough time for discussion for decision making. And to inform discussion, pre-reading, board members must commit to being prepared. That's true now as it was before. The board members must understand the documents presented and speak up if they don't understand them. Is the agenda for board meetings something to which everyone can contribute? Are board meetings run in such a way that everyone is encouraged to participate? Moving on to committees, use or discard based on current needs, potentially create new committees. Board members could take on new learning with the webinar participation. There's a plethora of webinars offered these days in what's happening. Read new research reports, etc. Share learning with the full board. We've probably all been forming task forces over the past year. Task force being an ad hoc team assigned to explore or determine a particular issue or decision, and then come back and make a recommendation and then dissolve. So it's important to retire ad hoc committees when necessary, but invent new ones to continually respond to shifting situations. Ad hoc committees, luckily, can include board and non-board members, including staff, experts, constituents. And some examples of ad hoc committees that have been formed recently include exploring shared services with other organizations in your community, undertaking a new area of programming, determining if long-standing programming is still valuable, how might it be revisioned through funding, design, resources, outcomes, participants, messaging. We'll examine this again a little bit later on. Above all, keep your board motivated. Check in regularly with board members between meetings. And you know, we do have a session, I think it's happening on the 4th, on motivating your boards remotely, held by a different consultant, which I'm certainly going to attend. And honor and recognize your board members at every opportunity throughout the year. They're not free staff. They're stewards with a legal and community responsibility. In this stressful times, celebrate the small victories, the hard work, and importantly, let board members know they're not alone. Introduce them to colleagues on boards who are having similar challenges.
Any questions or remarks before we segue to scenario planning?
I think we do have a couple questions, but I think they probably make sense at the end. So we'll just keep them organized for you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks. All right, lingo, right? Scenario planning, strategic planning, contingency planning. What's the difference? This is a time when cultural leaders and board members can really benefit from contemplation of the long term while still plotting the short term. As I think we all know, planning is a mixture of science and imagination. My little notes here. And times of stress can really, I think, crack open new ways of thinking and guide us to also crystallize our most critical purpose and, again, really crystallize our mission. So who's at the planning table, making the most timely and important decisions and asking the right questions? And what's the choice of roadmaps to use? I'm just going to run through a couple of different planning methodologies. You're probably familiar with them, but just to get them on the table. As Claire used a great analogy earlier, if your mission is your car that you're driving, your strategic plan is your roadmap, or what you plugged into your GPS, where you want to get to. Strategic planning generally positions the organization within your current environment and articulates how your organization will execute progress over time towards its mission. A strategic plan generally includes time-based objectives and strategies with measurable goals and who's responsible for reaching them. And usually a strategic plan covers 3 to 5 years. There is a session on how to conduct strategic planning during COVID-19 in this series that we encourage you to attend. Scenario planning, contingency planning have kind of been interchangeable in 2020. Although for some of us, of course, figuring out how to pay next month's rent and utilities is still a primary concern. Scenario planning in normal times would look even up to 7 to 10 years out. However, and strategic planning, again, 3 to 5 years. But in this particularly unpredictable time and with these multiple massive changes in our environment, it can really make sense to do much shorter term scenario planning. So for the purposes of this workshop, we're using contingency planning as what we've all been practicing in 2020, having an alternate plan should your situation change in the short to midterm. And just to remind you, this cheat sheet that Claire offered and that we'll share with you afterwards. Excuse me. Without reliable predictors, we've all set ourselves a number of short-term scenarios, ranging from best case to worst case, and ranging from perhaps 1 week to 1 quarter. And critically, if we're still doing this, we've come up with some agreed upon indicators, as Claire said, for when to kick into gear, when to trigger one particular scenario or contingency. So scenario planning can inform your strategic plan, but it can also be undertaken separately. Scenario planning is a what-if exercise in a little bit more depth than this slide represents, looking at possible combinations of external macro forces and trends, how those might affect your organization, and help you determine how your organization would respond. We're going to delve more deeply into scenario planning in our part 2 session next Monday. And again, part of planning is always evaluation. We touched on evaluation when we talked about board dashboards earlier, but I'll restate here the need for board and staff to agree what progress and success looks like and what information is necessary to determine that progress and success. In terms of determining these kind of triggers, Sea Change Capital Partners even has a very particular suggestion that, quote, boards should pre-commit to difficult actions if certain events come to pass. For example, an organization could pass a resolution now that if cash falls to a certain level, they'll stop paying the rent or will discontinue a certain program, end quote. So while we're not recommending that you stiff your landlord, this type of resolution does take some of the emotion out of making difficult decisions. You know, it's tough enough to cancel a beloved program, release staff, or make monumental decisions about an organization's future. So taking those steps on predetermined objective benchmarks can really help with some of that emotional distress and really helps those that are affected understand that it wasn't their personal or professional failure, but that these changes are due to the current environment and the current contractions. So, and a way to make emotional decisions a little bit more neutral.
Thanks, Molly. We'll just pause, breathe to absorb that. It was so much. We're going to kind of shift direction now and talk about enhanced communications, enhanced external communications. So I think we've talked a little bit about making sure that we're communicating properly internally. And now you've all had to deal with standardized messaging for the public, stakeholders, And we're going to talk about the public spokesperson roles. So there's 3 points. What are the standard talking points about your organization in general times? What are the revised talking points since COVID? And who is the designated spokesperson for the organization? So I'm going to come at it from a board member point of view here. What are the standard talking points about the organization? When you become a board member, your orientation packet will include a few bullet points to use in your important role as an ambassador for the organization, because you'll be talking about the organization to anyone who will listen, the way you talk about your favorite family member or your dog. But you'll be wanting to deliver the same information as the key staff about the organization's impact, programs, history, accomplishments, etc. So, even though it is in your voice, possibly it will have been generated by the staff so that we're all talking about the same thing. So what are the revised talking points since COVID? Stakeholders will be eager to know how you're doing in the age of COVID. You'll need internally generated talking points that all board and staff are using to deliver a consistent message. You'll still be talking eagerly about the organization. For those of you who are having a more difficult time at the moment, it's more important than ever that you deliver honest messaging, but that you don't sound desperate. So who's the designated spokesperson for the organization? Who is it? Is it the CEO? Is it the public information officer, the marketing director, the board chair? Whoever it is must be universally agreed upon by all at the organization. That person is the go-to person for delivering the news, be it glad or not glad, for each new situation, to press, media, stakeholders, staff, ticket holders, membership, etc. That does not mean that you as a board, staff, funder, or fan defer all questions to that one person. But here are some examples. If you have a public information officer, that person crafts the news release, so to speak, and delivers it alongside the CEO. So don't get ahead of that hierarchy and check in with that team before you share information and check that you have the talking points right. If the organization has to close temporarily, if you're opening again, if you've had an outbreak of COVID at your site, if you're doing major staff layoffs, if you've developed brilliant new projects, if you receive a major gift, sorry, development director, that probably isn't going to come from you. Chances are most of you just want to keep your public and funders apprised of the new programs you've cooked up and those that were planned that are on hiatus. But what happens when the public information chain goes awry? At a board meeting last week, the treasurer reminded us that it's critical that we all keep confidentiality, which is one of the tenets of board service, and speak with one voice. Over the summer, rumors had run away in the community, and the nonprofit, which was actually doing swimmingly well financially, was rumored to be going under. So nobody supports a loser, and we didn't want that message out there. I can think of a similar moment at an educational nonprofit serving children, where a minor incident had become out of proportion because the appointed spokesperson was blindsided. So that's a situation to avoid, and that was long pre-COVID. Molly, I think you had an example here that was useful to share.
Well, I think that what is also important, particularly if what you're communicating is a troubled situation or in a crisis, is that not only who is the designated spokesperson, but that everyone else knows that they are not. What you don't want is someone, perhaps a new board member who may not be fully informed, or staff members to be going off on social media or giving interviews, or talking without necessarily having all the facts, and as Claire said, following that appropriate chain. So making sure everyone knows their authority, but also their parameters.
Thanks, Molly. That was great. Okay, over to you.
Okay, next we're going to talk about how stress can create opportunities. Probably everyone has heard the quote, never let a good crisis go to waste, famously spoken by Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, although actually it's supposedly taken back in a quote from Sir Winston Churchill. But really, I wanted to talk a little bit about how stress isn't necessarily bad, even though it's usually talked about in a negative context. There is opportunity in stress. It can offer potential gain. So when you think about stress being a dynamic condition where someone or your organization is confronted with an opportunity or a constraint or a demand that kind of gets in the way or relates to your goal or what you're trying to accomplish, and where the outcome, what eventually happens, is perceived to be potentially uncertain, but also important, right? That's when the stress comes on. Organizational stress is created by internal dynamics. Those can be the demands of your role and your job, interpersonal demands, organizational structure, what the leadership culture is like, where in the organization's life stage it is. And that's something that Claire will talk about more in our session 2 next week. Environmental factors, certainly the current economic environment, the political environment, technology, public health, societal uncertainty and unrest. All of those are things that are creating constraints and demands on us. So if you're positive and concerned, you can help yourself turn your brain and your organizational's brain, being your leadership, staff, and board, into a broaden and build thinking, which allows you to process more possibilities. Which direction you go in is up to you. You can be active rather than paralyzed. And here's a quick visual that someone shared with me last year that I just think is great. When you look at the entire universe of what matters and what you can control, there's generally only a little bit of overlap. And that's really where you want to spend your time and attention. So just a little thought. Ways to use stress productively. Here are a few examples from your colleagues in the field. Folk Alliance International just surveyed their membership. 42% of respondents reported that their organization or a program within their organization, quote, has thrived during the pandemic. And in those who elaborated on their answers, they often commented about it was related to the act of trying a new effort and succeeding in accomplishing it, regardless of profitability. So this idea of kind of shared success, trying something new, something valuable, is really important in terms of organizational thriving. Look out for opportunities to reach out, collaborate, and share. You all may be in a community. There are so many examples of, Friday roundups where arts leaders who before might not have been willing to share their problems and challenges are getting on the horn once a week to collaborate and brainstorm together. Take the opportunity to connect with other board leadership, to learn from each other, share your challenges and support each other. Try to get rid of both internal and external silos. I've heard from a number of organizations that, existing job descriptions and hierarchies might not serve you well right now, either just because your environment has changed or you've had to reduce your staff. So de-siloing teams is something that is very productive. Looking at today's required results and not pre-COVID departments. So really just kind of throwing departments and job descriptions a bit up in the air for a few minutes to say, hey, what talents and connections do your staff have that don't fit into their job descriptions but can be leveraged for your organization? So consider the story of a museum who's learned that their lead custodian was a great calligrapher. And so the development staff found a great resource for exquisite donor thank yous. And the custodian was able to contribute to the organization that they cared about in a new way. And of course, we hope that they were compensated the same way that a contractor would have been. This is a time when really everything can be put on the table for discussion with no sacred cows. It can allow for opportunities to explore things that were previously out of bounds or just were literally unimaginable. It's also been found in a lot of organizations that they've been able to use the current situation to speed up changes that were necessary, but were just kind of lingering. So this is not an opportunity where you can dither or continue to drain resources. So whether those are time, money, or goodwill. It's also a time when you can identify new business opportunities generated by the crisis. The Alliance Theater here in my hometown of Atlanta has created Alliance at Work, a series of corporate training sessions, including strategic storytelling, emotional intelligence, professional presence, and anti-bias training. So while they're not able to have their main stage series, they're able to employ their artists, use their space, use their assets for income producing activities. This is a time to consider, again, restructuring your organization's architecture, physically or structurally, your infrastructure. Many of us have had to strengthen our digital infrastructure in this time. Some organizations, because they've had to downsize, have been conscious about creating a small core of full-time employees. These are the leadership, the people who really design and implement programs, have those community relationships, and then they augment that with a fluid circle of talented contractors. This is what the private sector calls open innovation. So many of us have had to become more adaptive and experimental. I'd like to give a shout out to EMC Arts. They have some outstanding free resources on their website about how to build your adaptive muscles as an organization. And do readiness planning to be ready for the next crisis now that you have some downtime. I'm gonna give a plug to my other organization, artsready.org, which can get you started on readiness planning for your entire organization. So we know we're throwing a lot at you. Any remarks, Michael, or questions before we move on to our last formal segment?
Yeah, we do have quite a number of questions about the role of the board. And I know that you talked a little bit between the relationship of staff and board. And so I wanted to present this question now so we can start to think of something. And we also have a lot of board chairs and board presidents here on the call today. And so the question that I got privately was, as the chair of the board, how best can they support their executive director during the pandemic and times of stress? What are the things that they can do as the chair to really take off some of the burden on our overburdened executive directors?
Do you want us to address that now, Michael, or do you want us to just think about it and address it towards the end?
I just laid that question to you. I would love to cover some of the relationship between those two entities towards the end.
That'd be great.
Great. Okay, this next section, emergency succession basics. This is one of the three homework opportunities that we'll have is an actual template for emergency succession. But most organizations I know don't have just a typical succession plan, much less an emergency succession plan. So I'm an advocate of both. But since we are in a time when things are unpredictable, thought it might be good just to kind of talk through the basics of an emergency succession plan so that you might consider developing one for your own organization if you don't have one already. Succession plans are important because there's the inevitable change in leadership that's going to happen. There is great information out there about how to do that in a thoughtful and productive way. Again, today we're going to talk specifically about emergency succession planning. This really ensures that you avoid interruption of critical executive duties when either the chief executive or the board chair for volunteer-run organizations is suddenly and unexpectedly absent, whether that's through illness or injury or death or just life issues coming to bear on them. So Compass Point Nonprofit Services has devised a sample emergency succession plan incorporating these best practices that I'll share with you today. An emergency succession plan, or an ESP, basically lays out the policies, processes, and responsibilities for the temporary or the permanent departure or absence of the chief executive or the board chair, and calls for the appointment of an acting executive director. So again, the plan should look at either a short-term temporary absence or long-term permanent departure of the leader. Short-term is generally considered to be 3 months or less, and it may be a situation when the person is expected to come back. And so this is just kind of a fill-in and keep the wheels moving. A permanent would be obviously when they're not expected back and you will need to fill the position. The general content of an emergency succession plan calls for both of these possibilities, and it's the same for both type of absences, with just a couple of key elements if it is indeed a permanent vacancy. So the plan should include the job description and the key functions of the executive director, which is useful in general if the board doesn't already have a copy of that, to be aware of the director's responsibilities and functions in the organization and in the community. The plan should denote who has the authority to appoint an acting executive director. This might be the executive committee or the board chair. It should be clear about the line of succession for the acting ED with a backup plan. For example, the deputy director followed by the CFO. And those in the line of succession should receive training from the ED when at all possible when the succession plan is developed. And part of the plan for this cross training could actually be part of the plan. A job description for an acting ED should be included, including their authority, their restrictions, what they can and cannot authorize, spend, decide, hire, fire, how the acting executive director will be compensated, and a communications plan to make stakeholders and funders aware of the temporary leadership structure. Again, having this in place ahead of time is important because when you're in a panic, it's hard to make these good decisions calmly. It's also important to be clear about how the board is going to provide oversight of the acting executive director. And although many of us have not lived in this situation in a perfect world, an acting director would not be in that role for more than, say, 3 months, because trying to carry 2 workloads beyond that is not likely to be productive. So if at all possible, Compass Point advises that for a long-term absence, that there are really 2 distinctions. One is that the plan identifies who will be responsible for managing the transition and how that permanent executive will be hired. Will it be the executive committee? Will you form a search committee, hire a consultant, et cetera? And it also would state the need for and the process to install an interim executive director. So this ESP should be completed and it should be approved by the board. It also should be signed by the board president, the executive director, the HR director, and those in the positions of line of succession, so that there is really transparency about expectations, responsibilities, and people are ready to step in at a moment's notice. Again, a full template and instructions for an emergency succession plan will be in the resources that we send out after today's session.
Thanks, Molly. I think we have a special guest that just joined us.
Okay, hi. It's not me, I will tell you that.
Oh, but it's another Michael.
All right, so we do have a special guest coming in, and thank you for everybody to staying on. I know this is a long webinar, but as you probably heard, we are super excited to welcome Michael J. Bobbitt as the new Executive Director of the Mass Cultural Council. Michael joins us right now. There he is. And so, Michael, do you want to say something to our field?
Sure. Hi, Field. How are you? I am so excited about day 2 of my tenure as the executive director. Super excited to be here. I got to hear a little bit of what Molly was just saying, and it's amazing. And I know you guys will get so much from this beautiful series of workshops that Michael has curated. So I'm going to enjoy the day. I'm a little upset at Puxatawny Phil for his 6 weeks of additional winter. And so I'm going to put some more clothes on. But I wanted to pop in and just say hi, and I'll be popping into these and listening a lot. So thanks, Michael. Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Kaylin. I see Kaylin's photo down there.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Come anytime you want, of course.
Thanks.
Okay, so I think at this point we are going to transition to questions and answers. Is that good, Claire and Molly?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we leave, Molly will describe the homework that she's sending us home with.
Perfect.
But I have been looking at some of the questions and they're really terrific. So I just can't wait to get going on those.
Great.
Let's see. So let me just quickly let you know what we'll be sharing afterwards. These are your homework options. We have a template dashboard along with the examples from Blue Avocado with and without color coding. We'll share with you the scenario planning cheat sheet that Claire presented. And again, also some tools for developing your emergency succession plan. I know how busy you all are, but we're really interested if you take on one of these between now and our session part 2 next Monday. There will be a chance as we get started to get some feedback from you all. Did you have a chance to do this? Did it work? What reflections did it provide? Did it provide any insights? Was it helpful? So we hope you'll be willing to share your experiences if you take on one of these little projects over the next week.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly and Claire. In the few minutes that we have left, we do have some questions that I would love to ask both of you, and then we can get some additional resources here. So going back to my initial question to you, from the board chair's perspective, from the board president's perspective, how can they best support the executive director during a pandemic or times of crisis?
Well, I just was thinking about this a little bit since you asked it, and I would say the number one thing to do is ask your chief executive, what do you need right now? Because you can make it up in your head and you may be right and you may be wrong. So I would go and ask them, and it could be something that's perfectly predictable to something that's completely unpredictable. I had a couple of other thoughts too, but Molly?
No, keep going, Claire.
Okay. Well, I would say just make sure you check in with your CEO every day. That may be too much. Then your CEO will tell you that's too much. I would say that in my experience over the past year, something that really bonded the CEO with the board chair with the CEO is to try and take a professional development opportunity together. I can think of some really great scenario planning, actually. Professional development opportunities that were offered on Zoom by some major foundations in our area. And, you know, these foundations are thought of very highly, and they offer a lot of no-cost professional development for board and staff as an ongoing basis. And this past year was no exception. And I watched some real good, bonding's the wrong word, but it was sort of like they had a shared project to work on together. And so it improved communication. Another thing is you might need some task forces for, like we were saying earlier on, I can think of 2 task forces on boards that I sit on that were formed that were both health task forces, because we happen to have some medical experts on the board. And they never thought that their medical expertise would be called upon, but it was. And so the chair just went out and made that one of his tasks. You can also help by being bad cop. You know, sometimes if there's some news that's difficult for the CEO to be delivering, a board president is the perfect person to step up to the plate. So those are some thoughts I had on that.
Those are wonderful, Claire. The other 2 that I came up with, one is, you know, in line with the ask, is be open. And, you know, your CEO might just need to vent, or they might want to bounce some ideas off of you that are really, you know, out of the box and out of the blue. And I would say being open to that and hearing that in a normal time might be just a little bit, you know, out of bounds is important. And the other is, this might be a time, you know, I'm very much of the mind that there are clear boundaries between the board's responsibilities and the staff's responsibilities, but this might be a time when actually the board taking on a bit of work, but understanding that that's a temporary thing might be helpful, and just being clear about, you know, that's going to get handed back, but right now we need this grant application in, or, you know, whatever it is. So
Great, thank you. I think, Claire, you said just a little bit about how often the board chair should be reaching out to the executive director, the CEO. How often should the CEO or the executive director be checking in with their board members during this time?
Well, I saw that question come in, and I thought that that was a good one. It seems simple, but I think the answer is it depends, because there are people that have various ways of engaging. You know, I mean, even in a board meeting live or in a board meeting Zoom, you'll notice the ones that are more verbal and the ones that are not. And I think it's the same way with communication. There are some board members that are going to wish for more conversation and those that wish for less. But I think to err on the side of more right now in terms of, and I would do this through the board chair, because the board chair should always be the conduit for communicating with the board, because that's just clean. And I think that you can just convene your board or your committees more frequently at this point, and just know that for some people that's going to work great, and for some people more is not good. But give it a try. You know what I mean? Like I said earlier on, now is not the time to be meeting less.
Great. We have a question. What should be included in the board's talking points about the organization right now during COVID? As you were talking about before, our board members are tremendous ambassadors for the organization. They're talking about the organization all the time. Obviously, the conversation right now is a little different. So they may not be able to tell the public exactly when they're going to reopen or what those conditions might look like, because those might be a little bit more on the staff side of things, or when they're going to start their programming again. But what's the big stories that board members should be talking about to the public about their organizations right now during COVID-19?
Well, I think that Molly has probably some better ideas than me, because she does, she's been dealing with emergencies for years. But I am a big fan of carrying a little, having for your board a little business card, size card. You can have them done very cheap to carry around so they know it's the current talking points. And in this case, less is more. Just talk about we're okay. Or we're not okay, but just decide how much to say. But I would say 3 talking points max is all that you want. Everybody's going to want to know when you open, and you can say, well, according to Anthony Fauci at the APAP conference, we get to open in fall of 2021. So that's kind of the guidance we're looking at. That kind of thing. Keep it short and sweet.
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, be honest, and be honest about, again, those projections. If you don't know, you don't know, but give your best estimate. And again, make sure that everyone has the most current information so that you don't have mixed messages out there in the community.
Great. The next question. Many of us are increasing racial equity in our boards during the same time that the boards are meeting only virtually, when it's harder to create the glue that leads camaraderie and the knitting of personal and collegial relationships. Is there any advice for how to do our best with integrating new trustees in ways that feel good to everybody?
Well, that actually will be a segment of a separate webinar that we'll be doing on recruitment and retention of new board members on February 11th, I believe, because it is an important issue, and kind of creating that culture. So I don't know, Claire, if you have some immediate thoughts off the cuff about this that we can share in just the couple minutes we have left.
Yeah, just a thought. Yay for you for asking the question. And I would say that both in terms of increasing the equity on your board and simply integrating new board members, because what we say in our recruitment and retention workshop is it seems strange to be adding board members to our board at this time, but we're doing it. And the boards I sit on, we are not increasing our board members, but we are integrating new board members, and they're thrilled to be on the board, and everybody wants a job to do. So I would say, unless you want to do Zoom happy hours, which some people do, and they're kind of fun, I would say the bonding comes for new board members just as it would be in the 4 times, which is let's make sure that we have projects to work on together. Your new board member wants a job to do. They don't want to just show up to the board meetings And it probably should be made clear in their orientation what it is that they can start doing right away as soon as they join the board.
Immediate productivity and impact.
Great. This is an issue that's near and dear to us in the cultural field. Many of the traditional institutional funders are actually, because of COVID, moving away from arts and culture and focusing on public health and food and different kind of insecurities. And so, and I know Kaylin and I have had many conversations with organizations, and they actually feel it's tough for them to ask for money at the same time when need for the human race right now is on epic levels. So is there any recommendations that you have about how board members can continue to keep their fiduciary responsibility to the organization, which of course includes fundraising, when there's a multitude of needs out there, particularly in what a lot of folks would view as really essential human needs?
Well, I'm going to jump in here because I think, Michael, we had a bit of a talk about this when you and I, or Molly and you and I were first talking about the subject matter for these. And as a professional fundraiser, you know, I can get on my soapbox for hours to say there's money to go around, and your needs is a bad word as far as I'm concerned. The investment that a funder can make in your organization is as valid. And now is not the time to de-advocate for funding for culture. Now is the time to re-advocate, because if it hasn't been more clear over 2020 than ever, people turn to the arts. And I'm actually impressed to see that some of the corporations that pulled back from funding the arts in 2020 have started to reinvest because they see the value of dynamic communities.
I agree. It's not either or, and your board needs to be a champion for you now more than ever.
Great. Another good question here about the dynamic between the executive director and the board. Do you have any tips for executive directors on how to give board members enough information so they know what's going on, especially during these times, but does not encourage them to get involved into the operations or the decisions that should fall into the realm of the executive director? Sometimes if you tell more, you get more when it comes to that. So any tips to executive director? Where is that sweet spot in information?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that, and I'm thinking of some of the EDs that I have worked with and are pretty good at being clear about what they are reporting, as in, you know, this is kind of a done deal, and, you know, they certainly will entertain questions, but is not something that is open to, but then it's very clear, then these are the things that are for the board's consideration and input. So I think both the ED and the board chair making those things very clear is important, and can cut some of that stuff off at the pass.
Well, and I would add that, you know, board members are never short of ideas, and it's great to share ideas. You know, we need to debate those ideas and know that some of them may go forward and some of them may not. And I'm reminded of the conversation we had yesterday, Michael, with some of your constituents who are so amazing, and whose board members just, I don't know of any board members that don't want to be more engaged right now, but some of them wanted to sort of jump in and talk about the latest report they'd heard about major institutions in the country doing major layoffs, and shouldn't we be doing that? And we'll talk about this more in session 2, but that sort of thing is the chief executive's responsibility. So yay for you board members for being informed, and just know what's governance and what's administration.
Great. Thank you, Molly and Claire. We are right up at 11:30, so I appreciate all of you hanging on for our first part here. I know Kaylin has been putting a lot of information into the chat about the additional sessions we have. We have a great one, as mentioned, coming up on Thursday about supporting and motivating board members remotely, because a lot of our meetings and interactions are taking place in that space. The second part of this one, and we're really excited because we're going to hear from our field in that session too. So that's also a great time to have that conversation conversation, and then a fourth one on board. So thank you all for sticking around. Again, like I said, you will be getting an email from me very shortly with a copy of all of the materials here, but Kaylin's put the Dropbox link for you to grab right away, and the video of our morning together. So thank you, Molly and Claire, and thank you for everyone. We'll keep seeing you for the next couple of weeks. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.